Stop for a second. Because what I'm about to tell you is not a headline. It's not a scandal. It's not even a political argument. It's the sound of an institution collapsing in silence. When nearly 3,000 lawyers walk out of the U.S. Department of Justice in less than 10 months, that is not turnover. That is not coincidence. That is a systemic failure revealing itself from the inside. Justice doesn't fall when courts shut down. It falls when the people who know how justice is supposed to work decide they can no longer participate. These were not junior lawyers chasing higher pay. They were the institutional memory, the mentors, the ones who trained generations, the ones who knew where the lines were and why crossing them mattered. When people like that leave en masse, the system has already crossed a point of no return. Before we go further, stay with me. Subscribe if you care about understanding how power actually erodes institutions, because stories like this are meant to be buried. Now, to understand why this is happening, we need to step back and ask a deeper question. What was the Justice Department designed to protect in the first place? To understand the scale of what's happening, we need to be precise about the problem. This is not simply a staffing crisis. It is not about budgets, burnout, or generational change. It is about the collapse of institutional neutrality. The Justice Department was designed to function as a firewall, a buffer between raw political power and the rule of law. Its legitimacy depends on one thing above all else: the belief that justice is administered without fear, without favor, and without obedience to any single individual. When that belief erodes, the system does not bend. It breaks. What we are witnessing is a Justice Department increasingly asked to serve political ends rather than legal principles. And when that happens, professionals face a choice: comply, stay silent, or leave. Thousands chose to leave. That decision tells us more than any press conference ever could. Because institutions do not fail when they are attacked from the outside. They fail when their own people no longer recognize them. To see how this became possible, we have to go back not to personalities, but to history, structure, and the slow mechanics of power. The Department of Justice was not designed to be powerful. It was designed to be restrained. After Watergate, the United States learned a hard lesson. When law enforcement answers directly to political power, democracy becomes fragile. So norms were built, firewalls were reinforced. Independence was treated not as a slogan, but as a survival mechanism. For decades, that system held imperfectly, but effectively. Presidents came and went. Parties rose and fell, yet the DOJ endured because it operated on precedent, procedure, and professional ethics rather than loyalty. But institutions are not defended by laws alone. They are defended by norms, and norms decay quietly. Over time, political pressure increased, media cycles accelerated, loyalty began to matter more than restraint. The expectation slowly shifted from serve the Constitution to serve the agenda. And once that shift occurs, history tells us what follows. Experienced professionals leave. Internal resistance weakens. The institution remains standing, but hollow. That hollowing sets the stage for crisis. And in this case, the first rupture came suddenly, visibly, and all at once. The first real rupture didn't arrive with a press release. It arrived as a quiet exodus. In one critical unit of the Justice Department, 2/3 of the lawyers resigned. Not reassigned, not transferred. They walked away. These were career professionals who had served under both Republican and Democratic administrations. People whose loyalty was not to a party, but to the law itself. And they left for a reason. They were being asked to cross lines, legal lines, ethical lines that once defined the limits of power. One lawyer, Arzanai, refused to mislead a federal court after a deportation violated a judge's order. He did what the system demands. And for that, he was fired. That moment matters. Because when truth-telling becomes punishable, silence becomes survival, and resignation becomes resistance. Stay with me here. This is where systems reveal their true nature. What followed was predictable and devastating. Cases stalled, prosecutors vanished, felony charges began to collapse at unprecedented rates. What looked like a staffing issue was, in fact, a legitimacy crisis. And beneath it all was a deeper mechanism, less visible, but far more dangerous. That explains why this breakdown accelerated so fast. What we're seeing is not chaos. It's a system operating under a new logic. The Justice Department has not simply lost people. It has been reoriented from an institution designed to constrain power into one increasingly shaped to protect it. And that shift changes everything. In healthy systems, prosecutors follow evidence. In corrupted systems, evidence follows permission. Once political loyalty becomes a factor, spoken or unspoken professional judgment collapses. Lawyers begin to ask the wrong questions. Not, is this legal, but is this allowed? Not, is this just? But who does this serve? That is the hidden mechanism driving the exodus. Experienced prosecutors understand where this road leads. They have seen it in other countries. They know that when institutions are captured, careers are used as leverage, silence is rewarded, and resistance is punished. So they leave. What remains is not neutrality, but compliance. Not expertise, but vacancy. Not justice, but procedure without legitimacy. And once that internal correction mechanism disappears, the system doesn't stabilize, it accelerates toward crisis. Which brings us to the second rupture, more public, more visible, and far harder to ignore. The second rupture was impossible to hide. The numbers gave it away. Across the country, criminal cases began collapsing after they were already filed. Normally, fewer than 1% of Justice Department cases are dismissed once they reach that stage. Now, that figure has surged toward 20%. That is not inefficiency. That is institutional failure. Prosecutors simply aren't there anymore. The expertise required to move complex cases forward, public corruption, corporate crime, organized networks, has vanished. And without trust in the institution bringing charges, juries hesitate, judges push back, convictions slip away. In Los Angeles, a case with clear video evidence should have been straightforward. The jury refused to convict. Not because the facts were unclear, but because the institution presenting them no longer commanded confidence. At the same time, major investigations stalled. Political cases advanced. Others disappeared. Resources shifted, quietly but decisively. This is what happens when enforcement becomes selective. The law remains on the books, but its application becomes uneven. And when justice feels arbitrary, its consequences spread beyond courtrooms. Because the real damage is not measured in dismissed cases. It is measured in how this collapse reaches into everyday lives. Now, let me bring this back to you. Because this is not an abstract institutional debate. This is about how safe, how protected, and how equal you actually are under the law. When cases are dismissed, it isn't politicians who pay the price. It's victims who never see justice. It's communities left exposed. It's ordinary people watching criminals walk free, not because the law failed, but because the system enforcing it broke down. And here's the hardest truth. When trust in justice disappears, people stop cooperating. Witnesses hesitate. Juries doubt. Citizens disengage. The social contract quietly unravels. You may never set foot in a federal courtroom, but the moment justice becomes selective, you feel it everywhere. Higher crime, deeper cynicism, more fear, less faith that rules apply equally. This is why your attention matters. This is why staying informed matters. Share this. Talk about it. Refuse to treat institutional collapse as background noise. Because once people stop believing the law protects them, they start believing it serves someone else. And when that happens, the consequences no longer stop at national borders. What happens inside the U.S.? Justice Department does not stay inside the United States. America's legal institutions have long functioned as a global reference point, not because they were perfect, but because they were seen as independent. When that perception collapses, the ripple effects are immediate. Authoritarian governments watch closely. They point and say, you see, this is what your rule of law looks like. Allies hesitate to cooperate on extraditions, sanctions, and cross-border prosecutions when they fear political interference. International cases slow. Trust fractures. And something more subtle happens. The moral authority of democracy weakens. For decades, the United States argued that institutions matter more than leaders, that systems outlast personalities. But when a justice system appears captured by one man's agenda, that argument rings hollow. This is how influence erodes, not through military defeat, but through institutional decay. Not with confrontation, but with credibility loss. Global stability relies on predictability. And justice systems are part of that architecture. When the world sees selective enforcement, politicized prosecutions, and mass professional exits, it doesn't just reassess America's leadership. It recalculates its risks. And once that recalculation begins, the future stops being abstract. It demands scenarios, paths forward, warnings, and consequences. From here, there are only 3 plausible paths forward. The first is repair. This requires time, leadership committed to institutional independence, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Experienced professionals return. Norms are restored. Enforcement becomes consistent again. This is the best outcome, but it is also the hardest, because trust, once broken, does not regenerate on command. The second path is stagnation. The Department of Justice continues to function, but only mechanically. Cases move slowly, political selectivity persists, public confidence remains low. The institution survives in form, but not in spirit. This is how decline becomes normalized. The third path is consolidation. Justice becomes openly instrumental. Loyalty replaces neutrality. Enforcement becomes a tool of power rather than a check on it. Professionals stop resisting and stop leaving because resistance no longer matters. At that point, the system does not feel broken. It feels settled. History tells us this is the most dangerous stage because people adapt. They adjust expectations. They stop remembering what independence once looked like. Which path emerges does not depend on any single election or individual. It depends on whether societies choose to defend institutions or merely watch them erode. That brings us to the final question. What responsibility rests with you? Here is the truth we avoid because it's uncomfortable. Institutions do not save themselves. People do. The Justice Department did not collapse overnight. It eroded while attention drifted elsewhere. While outrage moved on. While silence felt easier than vigilance. That is how democracies fail, not through spectacle, but through neglect. If justice becomes conditional, nothing else remains stable. Markets lose confidence. Communities lose trust. Politics turns zero-sum. And power, once unchecked, never checks itself. This is not about one administration. It is about whether the rule of law is a principle or a convenience. So don't look away. Stay informed. Demand transparency. Support independent journalism. Vote with intention. Speak when silence feels safer. If you want a place where we don't shout, don't spin, and don't simplify what deserves depth, subscribe and stay here. This conversation matters, and it continues. Because when people who understand systems stop paying attention, systems don't correct, they harden. And when good people decide this is too much or too exhausting, history records that moment clearly, not as a surprise, but as a choice. I'll see you in the next one.